Hello friends, my name is Joel. This is Summit, the 30th Sunday in Ordinary Time. This week we've got a classic gospel reading, one you actually have memorized. You just don't know you have it memorized yet. And before we get into that, as I've been reflecting on the readings, I've been thinking a lot about elementary school of all things. And I've been thinking about my lack of friends in elementary school. I was a very lonely kid. Recess, not a lot of friends. I played alone on the playground and actually just hated recess because I would rather have been in class learning, because at least in class I had something to do. And I've never forgotten that feeling. Even now as I'm talking about it, I still remember what it felt like to be on the outside, to see other groups of friends playing, but I wasn't a part of it. And this happened at a very young age, and yet that feeling sticks with me. We've all had that, right? We've all had moments where we felt like we were on the outside. Maybe in your particular friend group, there's like an inner circle that you are not a part of, and you know that sting to be outside of that inner circle. Or maybe you are away on a trip, or you're just at home and you're thumbing through Instagram and you see all of your friends together, but you are not there. You feel outside. Even growing up, I had a group of cousins who all lived close to each other, and at family gatherings, they all hung out, and the rest of us who didn't live close were kind of on the outside of that inner circle. It stings to be on the outside a little bit, and we've all been in situations like that. Now hold on to that feeling, because we're going to dive into the first reading. It comes in the book of Exodus, and Moses is giving commandments on behalf of God, where God is giving these things. And these are statutes that people need to obey. And here's the thing. So God speaks and he says, "You shall not oppress an alien," a foreigner, "for you were once aliens yourselves in the land of Egypt." Now God gives this explicit command that for people on the outside of the nation Israel, they are not to be oppressed. They're not to be kept on the outside, or they're not to be kept other. You shall not oppress them. Because he wants Israel, the nation Israel, to remember when they were outsiders, when they were slaves in Egypt, when they were oppressed. And he knows that one day Israel is going to become like Egypt. It's going to build cities. It's going to build a temple. It's going to build walls around their cities. They're going to establish armies. They're going to have chariots. And at a different point, God even warns against doing that. Because as we build, sometimes we push out. We try to maintain solidarity in our group for this sort of cohesion, and then we wind up oppressing others, either knowingly or unknowingly. So God explicitly condemns that. He goes through some other lines then in the book of Exodus where he talks about how we're to treat our neighbor. At one point he says, "If you lend money to one of your poor neighbors among my people, you shall not act like an extortioner by demanding interest. If you take your neighbor's cloak as a pledge, you shall return it to him before sunset." He goes through these different things. And God says, if they cry out to me, I'm going to hear the cry of these people. Now let's fast forward here to the gospel. All right. And if we're in the gospel, this is where you've got the things that you have memorized, even though if you don't realize that you've got them memorized, because it's the two great commandments, right? Love God and love your neighbor. Now pay attention to where this starts, because there's a little bit of a history here we got to go through. It says, "When the Pharisees heard that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees." The Pharisees and the Sadducees do not like each other. They're opposing groups with opposing ideologies. And the Pharisees, upon hearing that Jesus has silenced the Sadducees, are like, oh, this is our chance. Not only can we test Jesus and trip him up, by doing that, we can succeed where the Sadducees have failed. That's like a twofer. That's like a double win. And so that's what they're going for here. Now, this particular teaching, the two great commandments, appears in all the synoptic gospels. So it's also in the Gospel of Luke and the Gospel of Mark, and they add in some different details to this particular narrative. And I'm going to draw some of that in to put context into what is given in the Gospel of Matthew so that we can really dive into what's happening here, because it's key for us today in our walk of faith. So one of the Pharisees who has studied the law goes to test Jesus. And he says, "Teacher, which commandment in the law is the greatest?" Now, when you talk about the law and these commandments that were given to Moses by God, there are hundreds of them. Hundreds of these. And the Pharisees are a rigorous religious group. They want to make sure that they have a purity of their religion. So they follow these laws, or they claim to follow these laws, rigorously. And there is a greatest commandment, which is to love God with your whole heart, your whole soul, your whole mind. It's called the Shema. It's found in the book of Deuteronomy. But as scholars of the law look at this, this particular scholar may have looked at it and said, well, the thing is, all of these commandments are the greatest, the whole law, everything about it. So by trying to get Jesus to pick just one, they're actually looking to trap him in saying, oh, that's the one you think about is the greatest? Well, what about this one? What about this one? What about this one? So that they can enter into a dialogue to eventually get him to, by saying one is the greatest, trap him into saying, but these others aren't as important, right? Like they're trying to get him to do this. It's either one or the other. And so Jesus responds, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the greatest and the first commandment. And then, maybe anticipating what was going to come back out of this scholar of the law's mouth, he says, the second's like it. Now, the guy didn't ask him for 2 commandments. The scholar of the law asked for 1. Jesus says, the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. The whole law and the prophets depend on these 2 commandments. So in answering, Jesus does give an answer, but he also silences the Pharisees because he's saying everything in the law, all of these commandments that Moses gave, can be summarized in these 2 things, which are given as positive directions. You'll notice in the book of Exodus, there are do not statements. Don't oppress the foreigner. Don't demand interest. Don't take your neighbor's cloak. And sometimes those don't things are good, but Jesus is getting to the heart of the law. Love God with all your heart, soul, and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. Now, in other accounts of this story, Jesus is asked another question because the teacher, the scholar of the law, wishes to justify himself. And so he says, well, who's my neighbor? Again, a little bit of context. The nation Israel, those are your neighbors. Other people are foreigners. So even at this point, different mentalities or different attitudes had developed where these are things, these laws apply to people in Israel. So you treat people in Israel this way, but if you're a foreigner, there's a different set of standard for Gentiles, for non-Jewish folks. And the Pharisees, again, wanting a purity of religion, adhered to some of these things. And so Jesus then goes on to expand this, and in the Gospel of Luke, you get the parable of the Good Samaritan, who shows what a neighbor is. Who do you put on the outside? And maybe you do it explicitly. Maybe there are people in your life that you actually put on the outside. And I'm not talking about people we need to distance ourselves from because they're toxic people or they're people who have or could hurt us. I'm talking about the people you exclude just for the sake of excluding them. And maybe you do it explicitly. Maybe there's a group of people you really like to just pick on at school, at work, at youth group. Maybe it's things you do implicitly. Maybe you really have drawn lines over groups of people who you know or don't know or have a relationship with or don't, and you've sort of painted them with one brush stroke. Maybe there are groups of people that you're like, I don't associate with that group of people. They're not my neighbor. The lack of a love of neighbor is at the root of all relational sin. It's at the root of systemic sin. It's at the root of violence that we do to others, an inability to love our neighbor. And the only way that you can harm somebody else is to see them as your enemy and not your neighbor, to see them as other, to see them as different. Because the moment we start seeing somebody as a part of our group, as a part of our community, it becomes harder to harm that person, to do violence to that person, to sin against that person. And Jesus tying these commandments together is key because he's saying if you want to love God, you must also love your neighbor, who is created in the image and the likeness of God. There's something profound there. Because I think sometimes we justify an anger and almost hatred towards our neighbor under all of these weird religious pretenses. Now, don't get me wrong, we have to call people out for sin because we love them enough to call them out for sin. In fact, to not call somebody out on their sin is to start to make them other. It's to become selfish. It's to not love our neighbor. But there are a lot of times that we just say awful things about people we don't even know because we forget their human dignity. We make them something other than a child of God. So this week we have to be convicted by this, that we are not to look at others as being outside because we've all been outside. And ask ourselves what we can do in loving God enough to bring them in, to see them as our neighbor, and to love them as such. Doing so has a profound impact on who we are and how we see the world, because suddenly our perspective shifts. Remember, you've been outside. You've been hurt. You've been gossiped about. You've been excluded. Therefore, don't exclude. Don't gossip. Don't push outside. Don't make someone the other. Make them your neighbor, and your world will change. That's the 30th Sunday in Ordinary Time. Great stuff in the gospel. And again, you've got that memorized. Love God, love your neighbor. There it is. Enjoy the rest of your week. Enjoy Halloween. I'll see you back here next week on Summit.